I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Jonathan.
And we're in the Britain's Got Talent final. Nervous, excited.
Yeah, just a cocktail of emotions.
And it actually feels really far away. It doesn't feel like.
When Jonathan Antoine first stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in 2012, many people looked at him and silently judged. Overweight, shy, barely making eye contact, he seemed an unlikely star. But then he opened his mouth and the room transformed. His voice was not just good, it was otherworldly. Goosebumps, tears, a nation stunned. But what happened after the spotlight faded? Where did Jonathan go when the cheers quieted down? This isn't just a story of fame, it's a story of pain, loyalty, transformation, and raw human strength. Stay with us as we uncover what really happened to Jonathan Antoine, the shy teen who shocked a nation. It was a typical night for viewers of Britain's Got Talent. The crowd buzzed, the judges braced for another act, and in walked two teenagers, Charlotte Giaconelli and a young man with thick, curly hair, round glasses, and an unsure expression. His name was Jonathan Antoine. He looked down, visibly nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he stood beside Charlotte. No one in the audience expected anything remarkable. If anything, they looked on with a mixture of curiosity and quiet skepticism. The judges leaned forward, their faces unreadable. Simon Cowell raised an eyebrow. The performance had not even begun, but first impressions had already taken root. Charlotte spoke first with a confident smile. Then Jonathan, barely audible, introduced himself. His voice was soft, uncertain. It was clear he did not like being in the spotlight. When asked if he had confidence, he admitted he struggled with it. His honesty drew a few empathetic smiles from the audience, but still, expectations remained low. As the music swelled for The Prayer, the same song famously performed by Andrea Bocelli and Celine Dion, no one could have predicted what would follow. Then Jonathan began to sing. From the very first note, the entire auditorium fell silent. His voice was not just strong, it was operatic, emotional, and rich beyond his years. The contrast between his timid demeanor and his commanding voice was almost surreal. Charlotte's harmonies complemented him beautifully, but it was Jonathan's voice that held the room in awe. Amanda Holden blinked rapidly, clearly holding back tears. David Walliams stared in disbelief. Simon Cowell, known for his harsh critiques, watched intently, visibly impressed. The performance ended with thunderous applause. People jumped to their feet. Some in the audience were crying. Even the judges were momentarily speechless. Simon was the first to speak, and what he said shocked many. He told Jonathan that he was, without question, a future star. He even added that while Charlotte was good, Jonathan had something rare. Amanda called them utterly spellbinding. The public reaction mirrored the judges. Overnight, Jonathan and Charlotte became household names. That clip of their audition went viral, racking up millions of views. But beneath all the newfound attention and praise, Jonathan remained the same soft-spoken boy who had barely believed in himself. What the world did not know then was just how much Jonathan had overcome to stand on that stage. The bullying, the self-doubt, the battles with anxiety, it all lived behind the voice that had just moved a nation. That night on Britain's Got Talent was not just a debut performance, it was a personal breakthrough. For the first time in his life, Jonathan was not hiding behind fear. He was facing it, one note at a time. And while the world had discovered a new musical prodigy, Jonathan was just beginning to discover himself, a voice that silenced every doubt. The standing ovation from that first audition was only the beginning. As Jonathan Antoine walked off the stage with Charlotte, the weight of what had just happened still clung to him. He had sung with his whole soul, and for the first time in his young life, he was being celebrated instead of ridiculed. Backstage, his hands still shook, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming shock of being embraced by a crowd that minutes earlier had sized him up and silently dismissed him. In a matter of moments, the world had seen what his family and music teachers had always known. He was no ordinary teenager, he was a phenomenon. Jonathan's voice had a rare quality that could not be taught. It was the kind of sound that carried emotion without needing translation. Viewers across the country were captivated not just by the performance, but by the transformation they had witnessed in real time. The boy who could barely look up had become a lion when he sang. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know who he was. The media praised him. Headlines called him the new Pavarotti, and the voice that came from nowhere. Jonathan's story was everywhere. His voice had silenced every doubt anyone had about him, including the ones he held against himself. But fame brought its own challenges. For Jonathan, who had long struggled with confidence and bullying, the sudden spotlight was both a dream and a test. His size and appearance had always been the subject of cruel jokes from peers. Even though his voice now drew admiration, the comments about his weight had not completely disappeared. This time, however, something had shifted. People were defending him. Strangers online wrote messages of support. Teachers and classmates who once overlooked him began to acknowledge his gift. Yet Jonathan remained grounded, refusing to let fame change the core of who he was. As the show continued, so did Jonathan and Charlotte's journey through the competition. With each round, their performances grew stronger. Whether they were performing operatic duets or stirring ballads, the chemistry between them deepened. But it was Jonathan's voice that always stole the moment. Even critics who normally had little time for classical crossover acts found themselves pausing to acknowledge the power of his talent. Still, Jonathan was humble. He never saw himself as the star. He always credited Charlotte, his vocal coaches, and the audience for giving him the strength to keep going. In interviews, he often spoke softly, deflecting attention and focusing instead on the joy of making music. That humility became part of his charm. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing freedom. Every note he sang chipped away at years of insecurity. Every applause reminded him he belonged. He was no longer the boy who sat alone at lunch. He was a symbol of unexpected greatness. And as the finals approached, one question echoed across the nation. Could Jonathan Antoine and Charlotte Giaconelli go all the way and win Britain's Got Talent? Friendship, fame, and sudden stardom. As Jonathan and Charlotte advanced to the finals of Britain's Got Talent, the pressure mounted. Each performance came with more media attention, more rehearsals, and more opinions from the public. But behind the scenes, one thing remained steady: their friendship. It was the bond between the two that kept Jonathan grounded. Charlotte had known him before the cameras, before the applause, and she remained his anchor. Their connection was more than musical. She was the one who encouraged him to audition in the first place. Without her, he might never have stood on that stage. In interviews, Jonathan always made it clear how grateful he was to have Charlotte by his side. She had helped him believe in himself at a time when very few others did. Their duets weren't just beautiful because of vocal technique. They were emotional because of the trust they shared. When Jonathan faltered with nerves, Charlotte steadied him. When Charlotte hit a high note, Jonathan lifted her with harmonies that felt like a warm embrace. Audiences weren't just watching a performance. They were witnessing two teenagers support each other in the most public way possible. Their rise to fame after the show was swift. Even though they came in second place, their careers took off immediately. A recording contract followed, along with appearances on major TV shows and performances across the country. Fans lined up for autographs. Journalists called them the future of classical crossover. But with the spotlight came new challenges. Fame is never easy to handle, especially at such a young age. Suddenly, every movement, every facial expression, every note was dissected. The public adored them, but the pressure to stay perfect was overwhelming. Jonathan, in particular, felt the weight of expectations. He had become the breakout star of the duo, and while he remained humble, the spotlight often lingered on him longer than on Charlotte. Some in the media began speculating whether he would eventually go solo. There were whispers that Simon Cowell had already seen the potential for Jonathan to become a solo phenomenon. Though nothing had been confirmed, the rumors stirred tension. Fans chose sides. Some insisted the magic was in their duo. Others were already imagining Jonathan as the next global tenor. But through it all, Jonathan and Charlotte stayed united, at least publicly. They laughed together during interviews, teased each other on stage, and always spoke of their journey as ours rather than mine. For Jonathan, fame without Charlotte by his side would have felt hollow. She had been there before the transformation. She had seen him at his most vulnerable. And now, even as their faces graced magazine covers and album posters, he clung to the comfort of her presence. Together, they had turned a talent show audition into a fairy tale. But fairy tales rarely last forever. And soon the duo would face a decision that would change everything: the pain behind the spotlight. On stage, Jonathan Antoine looked like he was finally thriving. He stood taller, smiled more often, and let his voice carry confidence that had once been buried beneath years of insecurity. But behind the curtain, the pressure of sudden fame was beginning to take its toll. While his voice soared to new heights, his mind was wrestling with familiar demons. No amount of applause could erase the years of bullying he had endured or the deep scars it had left behind. Jonathan had been teased throughout his childhood, not just for his weight, but for being different, for being quiet, for being sensitive. And now that he was in the public eye, those old voices sometimes returned louder than ever. Fame brought attention, but not all of it was kind. While many fans praised him, others on social media made cruel remarks. The same appearance that had led people to underestimate him during his audition was now being scrutinized by millions. Jonathan tried to ignore it, but some comments cut deep. He had worked so hard to believe he was enough, and yet the world seemed to constantly remind him of what he was not. He turned to food for comfort at times, even though he knew it was hurting him physically. The pressure to keep performing, to keep smiling, to keep singing at his peak, all while battling anxiety and body image issues, became overwhelming. Charlotte remained a source of support, but even she could not fully protect him from the isolation that fame brought. Public events exhausted him. Interviews drained him. The bright lights that once felt like a dream began to feel like a trap. Jonathan started to pull back, spending more time alone, retreating into music as a form of escape. Singing still brought him peace, but even that began to feel like a responsibility rather than a release. There were moments when he questioned whether he belonged in the industry at all. He had never dreamed of being famous. All he wanted was to sing. But now he was expected to be a celebrity, to maintain an image, to meet deadlines, and to stay strong even when he felt broken. The same gift that had saved him was now demanding everything from him. And for someone who had never fully healed from the wounds of childhood, it became too much to carry in silence. In private, Jonathan began seeking therapy and support to manage his mental health. He spoke openly about his struggles with anxiety and depression, choosing honesty over the illusion of perfection. That choice, though painful, would ultimately become one of his greatest strengths, because beneath the polished performances and the roaring crowds was still that same boy from the audition stage, fragile, gifted, afraid, and incredibly brave. The world saw a star, but few knew just how much it hurt to shine. And as the whispers about a possible solo career grew louder, Jonathan would soon be forced to confront a decision that went far beyond music. Simon Cowell's offer that changed everything. As Jonathan struggled privately with anxiety and self-doubt, the world around him kept moving forward. He and Charlotte had released their first album together, and it had done well commercially. Fans still adored them, and they continued to perform across the UK and beyond. But behind the scenes, the tension that had once only existed in quiet whispers was now taking form in real conversations. The industry had taken notice of Jonathan's singular talent, and one of those voices belonged to Simon Cowell himself. During their time on Britain's Got Talent, Simon had made a controversial offer. After their audition, he had pulled Jonathan aside and suggested that he consider going solo. His exact words implied that Charlotte might be holding him back, not because she lacked talent, but because Jonathan's voice was something altogether rare. That comment created a storm among viewers. Some saw it as cruel, others believed he was simply being honest about Jonathan's potential. For Jonathan, it planted a seed that he did not know what to do with. He had always been loyal. He credited Charlotte with encouraging him to audition in the first place. The idea of stepping out without her felt like betrayal. Yet the offer lingered in the background, growing louder as his internal battles continued. In the months that followed, more professionals echoed Simon's sentiments. Record executives, vocal coaches, and managers all began to suggest that Jonathan had the range, power, and emotion to be a solo artist in his own right. He was no longer just the shy boy with the big voice. He was a rising star who could potentially fill opera houses and concert halls around the world. But with that potential came a painful decision: stay in the comfort of the duo that brought him to fame, or leap into a terrifying unknown and pursue a solo career. The pressure mounted until it could no longer be ignored. Jonathan and Charlotte sat down and had a conversation that both of them had feared was coming. It was quiet, honest, and emotional. They were not angry. They were heartbroken. Because even though their friendship had carried them through the highs and lows of fame, they both knew it was time to take separate paths. Charlotte had her own dreams and musical style she wanted to explore. Jonathan, too, was starting to realize that in order to grow, he would have to risk standing alone. When they eventually made the announcement that they were parting ways musically, the public responded with sadness but also respect. There was no scandal, no feud, just two friends acknowledging that their journey together had come to its natural end. But for Jonathan, the real journey was just beginning. He was about to step onto a new stage not just as a performer, but as a young man learning to face the world without a shield. The decision to go solo would define the next chapter of his life, both musically and personally, the quiet breakup of a beloved duo. When Jonathan and Charlotte announced the end of their musical partnership, it did not come with a dramatic press conference or bitter headlines. Instead, it was quiet and respectful, much like the way they had always carried themselves. But for their fans, it was heartbreaking. Many had grown attached not only to their voices, but to the warmth of their friendship. They were seen as two halves of a whole, and the idea of one without the other felt like the end of something sacred. Yet behind the scenes, the separation had been inevitable for some time. Both Jonathan and Charlotte knew that their bond had run deeper than music, and that was precisely why they were able to part with grace. There was no jealousy, no anger, only mutual understanding. Charlotte had begun exploring musical theater, leaning into styles that reflected her personal taste and strengths. Jonathan, on the other hand, had felt a growing pull toward the operatic and classical world, where he could dive deeper into the genre that made him feel most alive. Their voices were moving in different directions, and it was time to honor that evolution. Still, the transition was painful. For Jonathan, losing Charlotte's presence on stage meant losing a kind of safety. She had been his comfort in every public performance, a steady hand through the chaos of instant fame. Now he would have to navigate the music industry alone, without her encouragement or shared laughter during sound checks and rehearsals. The silence where she once stood was loud and unfamiliar. The media was surprisingly kind during the split, perhaps sensing that this was not a story of conflict, but of growth. Interviews remained civil. Their social media posts expressed gratitude and affection for each other. But even with all the maturity in the world, Jonathan could not ignore the ache. For all the talk of stepping into greatness, he was still that same anxious boy at heart, now facing a world that expected so much more from him. The first few months after the breakup were filled with uncertainty. Jonathan returned to vocal training, this time more intensely than ever before. He began working with coaches who pushed him past his comfort zones. There were moments of doubt, when he questioned whether the world wanted him as a solo act, or whether the magic had always been in the duo. Yet deep inside, he knew this was the path he had to walk. Not because Simon Cowell had suggested it, not because the industry demanded it, but because there was something in him that had not yet fully awakened. He had a voice that needed to be shaped, a story that needed to be told in his own time and his own way. And though the stage now felt emptier, he also sensed that it was waiting just for him. The quiet breakup of the duo that once captured a nation's heart was not the end. It was the beginning of Jonathan Antoine's true journey, the reinvention of Jonathan Antoine. After the separation from Charlotte, Jonathan Antoine faced something far more daunting than a solo career. He faced himself. No longer part of a duo, there was no one to share the weight of expectations or absorb the spotlight with him. Every note he sang, every interview he gave, every move he made now reflected him alone. The silence that had once been filled by Charlotte's voice now echoed with uncertainty. But within that silence, Jonathan began to hear something new. It was not the voice of critics or fans or managers. It was his own. The first step in his reinvention was retreat. While others expected a rapid release of solo albums and public appearances, Jonathan chose to slow down. He spent time away from the noise, returning to the basics. He worked on his technique, trained with world-class vocal coaches, and listened deeply to the kind of music that stirred his soul. Classical pieces, operatic arias, modern crossovers that blended his passions with his potential. For the first time, he was not performing for approval. He was singing for discovery. The physical demands of solo performance were intense. Without the presence of Charlotte, Jonathan had to carry entire sets alone. His stamina, both physical and emotional, had to evolve. He began exercising more, focusing on breath control and endurance. He changed his diet, took better care of his health, and gradually began shedding weight. But more than anything, he began to shed fear, the kind that had haunted him since childhood, the kind that whispered he was not enough. When Jonathan released his debut solo album, it was not just a collection of songs, it was a declaration. His voice, richer and more mature, now carried the layers of someone who had walked through fire and come out still singing. Critics praised the album for its emotional depth and clarity. Listeners, both old fans and new ones, were stunned by the transformation. He was no longer the timid boy hiding behind Charlotte's strength. He had become a man stepping into his own power. What set Jonathan apart was not just his voice, but his honesty. In interviews, he spoke openly about his mental health, about the pressure of fame, and about the ongoing journey to love himself. That vulnerability became part of his artistry. People did not just hear his voice, they felt his story in every performance. His reinvention was not loud or flashy, it was quiet, steady, and deeply personal. Though the road had been painful, Jonathan now stood at a place where he could look back and see the purpose in the breaking. Losing the duo, facing the silence, rebuilding from the ground up, all of it had led him here, to a voice that was finally his own. And as the doors to international stages began to open, it became clear that Jonathan Antoine was not just reinventing himself, he was reintroducing himself to the world. From BGT star to international opera sensation, Jonathan Antoine's reinvention was not merely a personal transformation, it became a passport to the world. As his solo career took flight, the same voice that once stunned Britain began to resonate far beyond its borders. Invitations came from across Europe, the United States, and even parts of Asia. Classical festivals, opera houses, and crossover events all wanted a piece of the young tenor whose voice now carried more than power, it carried soul. Jonathan had officially stepped out of the shadow of Britain's Got Talent. He was no longer defined by a television show. He was carving out a legacy of his own. Audiences were mesmerized by the maturity of his voice. It was deeper now, more resonant, and carried with it the echoes of everything he had endured. When he stood on international stages, there was no pretense. He sang with a kind of openness that disarmed people. Many who came expecting technical brilliance left talking about the emotion. Critics began to use words like haunting, sublime, and transcendent. His performances did not feel like recitals. They felt like confessions wrapped in melody. And that sincerity began to set him apart from others in the classical and operatic world. Jonathan's albums began topping classical charts in multiple countries. His second solo album cemented his place as not just a former BGT finalist, but a legitimate force in the genre. He collaborated with orchestras, renowned conductors, and artists who had spent decades in the industry. Each time he brought something different to the stage, a youthful vulnerability, a lived-in wisdom, a reminder that great art is not born from perfection but from truth. But fame on an international level came with its own set of challenges. Travel was exhausting, schedules were relentless. The demands of vocal upkeep meant constant discipline, early mornings for rehearsals, late nights for performances, and endless interviews in between. There were days when Jonathan felt the weight of it all creeping back in, the old anxiety, the fear of letting people down. But this time he was better equipped. He had therapy, he had a support system. Most importantly, he had confidence born not from applause but from survival. Despite the busy schedule, Jonathan made it a point to connect with his audience. After performances, he would meet fans, take time for those who had followed him since the BGT days, and thank those who had supported his journey. He often said he never wanted to lose the feeling of being the boy who had once doubted everything about himself. That memory grounded him. It kept the fame from becoming a mask. From London to Los Angeles, Tokyo to Toronto, Jonathan Antoine was no longer the underdog. He was the headline act, the sold-out name, the rising star who had learned how to rise not just in volume but in purpose. His voice was no longer just his gift, it had become his message. And the world finally was listening. The weight loss and health transformation. As Jonathan Antoine's international career soared, There was a noticeable shift not just in his music but in his appearance. Fans who had followed him since his Britain's Got Talent days began to see the difference. His face looked slimmer, his posture straighter, his eyes brighter. The transformation was not overnight, nor was it the result of some flashy fitness campaign. It was the quiet result of years of effort, setbacks, and finally a decision that had little to do with fame and everything to do with freedom. Jonathan was not changing his body for the public. He was doing it for his voice, his health, and most of all, for himself. He had always been open about his struggles with weight and the mental battles that came with it. During his teenage years, food had been both a comfort and a shield. When the world felt cruel or overwhelming, food offered a moment of relief. But as he grew older and began performing on larger stages, he realized his body was carrying more than just emotional burdens. His stamina was affected. His breathing suffered during long arias. His physical strength could no longer keep up with the demands of his schedule. Something had to change, not because anyone told him to, but because he was finally ready to take care of himself in the same way he cared for his craft. Jonathan approached weight loss the same way he approached music, with patience, discipline, and respect for the process. There were no crash diets or gimmicks. He worked closely with professionals who understood the needs of a singer. Vocal health was always the priority. He changed his eating habits gradually, began exercising in a way that suited his body, and most importantly, started healing his mindset. He learned to stop associating food with shame and began to view his body as a partner in his journey, not an obstacle. The results came slowly, but they came. His voice gained even more clarity, his breath control improved, his performances became less physically draining. He felt lighter not just in body, but in spirit. The change was visible, but it was the internal shift that mattered most. Jonathan began to enjoy things he had once avoided: walking through airports without fear of being stared at, wearing clothes he once thought he could never fit into, and looking in the mirror without flinching. Still, he was quick to remind others that health is not a straight path. He had difficult days. He had moments when doubt crept back in. But now he had tools to face those moments without spiraling. His story of transformation was not about achieving an ideal size. It was about reclaiming his strength. And for a man whose voice had already moved millions, this new chapter proved something even more powerful. Jonathan Antoine had not just found his voice. He had finally learned how to live in harmony with the body that carried it. How he found his true voice. Jonathan Antoine's journey of transformation was not only physical, it was spiritual, emotional, and artistic. As he continued shedding the weight of his past, he began to discover something even more profound than a renewed sense of health. He found his true voice, not just the operatic tenor that had stunned judges and audiences years ago, but the voice within the one shaped by hardship, recovery, and personal growth. This was the voice that began to surface in his music, in his interviews, and in the way he carried himself. It was no longer just about technique, it was about truth. In the early days of his career, Jonathan sang beautifully, but always with a layer of hesitation. There was still fear in his tone, a faint sense that he was seeking approval or trying to prove that he belonged. But as he became more comfortable in his own skin, the sound changed. It grew warmer, deeper, more expansive. His performances no longer felt like auditions. They felt like conversations with the soul. Whether he was singing in English, Italian, or Spanish, his audience felt something authentic. His voice had become a vessel for emotion. It was not just the notes that moved people. It was the honesty behind them. Jonathan began choosing music that spoke directly to his experience, pieces that reflected struggle, redemption, longing, and love. He was no longer boxed into what others thought he should sing. He started blending opera with contemporary genres, creating a unique sound that allowed him to reach across generations and cultures. He was not afraid to experiment. He would take a classic aria and pair it with a cinematic score, or reinterpret a modern ballad with operatic intensity. The result was something deeply personal and artistically bold. But perhaps the most striking change was not in his sound, but in his presence. On stage, Jonathan no longer looked like someone trying to escape his past. He looked like someone who had made peace with it. He stood taller. He held eye contact with his audience. He spoke between songs with warmth and humor. He invited listeners into his world rather than hiding behind a wall of formality. And people responded. Audiences who had followed him since he was a shy teenager on BGT now saw a man fully owning his gift. Off-stage, he became more involved in mental health advocacy, using his platform to encourage others who felt voiceless. He shared openly about his therapy, his setbacks, and his healing. That transparency only made his art more powerful. Because when Jonathan sang now, he did not just perform. He told the story of a boy who was once broken by fear but rebuilt by grace. In finding his true voice, Jonathan Antoine did something many artists never do. He stopped performing for permission and began singing from a place of wholeness. And in doing so, he gave others the courage to find their own voice too. Life away from the cameras. As Jonathan Antoine continued to rise as a respected solo artist with a voice that now carried wisdom as much as beauty, the spotlight that once followed his every move began to dim by his own design. He had proven himself on stages around the world. He had conquered arenas, captured hearts, and redefined what it meant to be a classical artist in the modern age. But when the curtain closed and the lights faded, Jonathan returned to something much quieter. A life that was intentional, grounded, and far removed from the chaos that often consumes those who achieve fame so young. He now lives with more balance. There are rehearsals, recordings, and tours, but also long walks, books, and evenings spent with loved ones. The legacy of a voice that almost stayed hidden. In the stillness of his current life, away from the stage lights and screaming crowds, Jonathan Antoine carries something deeper than fame. He carries a legacy. Not the kind measured by awards or headlines, but one etched in the hearts of those who saw themselves in his story. His voice may have captured global attention, but it was the journey behind it, the fear, the pain, the perseverance that left a lasting mark. What makes Jonathan's story extraordinary is not just the power of his singing, but the miracle that it was ever heard at all. Looking back, it is almost impossible to believe that this same man once hesitated to audition, that he almost let anxiety and self-doubt keep him from stepping on stage, that he once believed he was too broken, too different, too invisible to matter. But the world heard him, and more importantly, he began to hear himself. Through every aria, every performance, every raw and honest confession, Jonathan reclaimed his place in a world that had once tried to silence him. He became a voice for the misfits, the anxious, the unheard, and that has become his true legacy. Young singers now reference him as an inspiration. Mental health advocates share his interviews as a beacon of hope. Parents tell their children his story when they need courage. And audiences, whether they are sitting in opera houses or watching from hospital beds, feel less alone when Jonathan sings. Because his voice does not come from a place of perfection. It comes from a place of survival. It is a voice shaped by rejection and molded by resilience. Jonathan himself understands the weight of that impact. He carries it humbly. He does not see himself as a savior or a hero. He is still learning, still growing, still healing. But he knows that the road he walked with all its pain and beauty was not just for him. It was for every person who has ever questioned their worth, every person who has ever been told they were too much or not enough, every person who still wonders if their voice matters. As he continues to make music, Jonathan chooses projects that reflect his values. He sings not just to impress, but to comfort, not just to be heard, but to connect. And though he still fills theaters and receives standing ovations, he no longer needs those things to feel seen. He has already won the quiet battle within the one that matters most. In the end, Jonathan Antoine's greatest triumph is not the fame he achieved, but the fear he overcame. His story reminds us that talent can be a gift, but truth is a calling. And when the two meet, something extraordinary happens. A voice that once trembled with doubt becomes a force of healing. A boy once afraid to speak becomes a man whose voice will echo long after the music fades. Jonathan Antoine's journey is more than a story of a boy with a golden voice. It is the journey of someone who overcame bullying, anxiety, and deep-rooted insecurities to become one of the most beloved classical voices of his generation. From a shy teenager trembling on a stage to an international artist singing with power and peace, Jonathan's transformation has inspired millions. But his legacy is not just his voice, it is his courage to be seen, to heal, and to stand in his truth. He proved that greatness is not defined by appearance or public approval, but by authenticity and perseverance. If his voice moved you, it is because it carries every scar, every step, every silent battle he ever fought. And that, more than any award or headline, is what makes Jonathan Antoine unforgettable. His voice did not just rise, it helped others rise with him. What can you say about Jonathan's life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and share our stories. Hit the subscribe button for more.